Over the past decade, we've seen a disturbing trend where Westerners are increasingly turning against their own culture and values. Suddenly, despite winning what is basically the lottery of birth, being born in a developed, industrialized and safe nation, everything Western is seen by many people as shameful and even evil. But why is this happening? How did the very principles that built these nations, principles like freedom, democracy and individual rights, become targets of criticism and, more importantly, self-loathing? Worse, this is making way for dangerous ideologies and hostile religions to fester and threaten the very institutions and values that make Western nations exceptional. One of the most significant factors fueling this self-criticism is historical guilt. It's rather pronounced in countries like Australia, where I am. This stems from Western nations' colonial past, the atrocities of slavery and the exploitation that accompanied imperialism. Look, these certainly did lead to some dark chapters in Western history, and understandably, they have left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, leading many to question the moral foundation of their societies. But here's the irony that I often find with this argument. People who never were colonialists or slavers having to feel guilty in perpetuity for things they did not do to people who never were slaves or lived in colonial times. Many self-hating Westerners believe that it's not just enough to acknowledge the errors of the past, but that it's imperative to make amends for them, indefinitely. In recent years, this has evolved into something rather profound, a pervasive sense of guilt that permeates discussions about Western culture and values. It's become fashionable, even virtuous, to embrace self-loathing, with colonialism often cited as the primary reason. This often manifests as a rejection of the very principles that were once considered the bedrock of Western civilization. Let's look at colonialism. While it undeniably brought about exploitation and suffering in many parts of the world, it also laid the foundations for the global spread of Western legal systems, education, and infrastructure. For example, the legal frameworks in countries like India, Nigeria, and Canada still bear the hallmarks of British legal principles, emphasizing the rule of law, individual rights, and due process. These are values that, despite their colonial origins, have become integral to the functioning of modern democratic states around the world. The spread of education systems too brought with it the English language, which today serves as a global lingua franca, facilitating international diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange.
Do you speak any English?
Similarly, infrastructure projects initiated during the colonial era, such as railways, ports, and administrative buildings, often laid the groundwork for the economic development of these regions. These projects, while driven by colonial interests, have nonetheless contributed to the modernization and integration of many parts of the world into the global economy. And no, before a bulk buy of blue hair dye points to colonialism as a primary driver of the West's rapid development, it was actually internal factors that played the most crucial role. The Industrial Revolution, which catapulted the West into unprecedented levels of technological and economic advancement, was driven by technological innovation. Inventions like the steam engine and mechanized textile production were the result of internal ingenuity and scientific progress, not colonial exploits. The agricultural revolution that preceded industrialization also laid the foundation by increasing food production and supporting population growth, which in turn provided a surplus labor force ready to power the new industries. Europe's rich deposits of natural resources, especially coal and iron, were pivotal. These resources fueled the machinery and infrastructure necessary for large-scale production, making the region self-sufficient in driving its industrial growth. Furthermore, the rise of Western industry was supported by sophisticated economic and financial systems. The development of banking, capital markets, and trade networks provided the financial backing for industrial expansion, driven by a capitalist economy focused on innovation and profit. Yet, today, the focus is overwhelmingly on the negative aspects of Western history, on the exploitation, the subjugation, and the cultural erasure that accompanied colonial rule. This one-sided view appears to have fostered a kind of historical amnesia, where the significant contributions of Western civilization to internal and global development are overshadowed by its undeniable wrongs. It encourages a mentality where everything associated with Western history is seen through a lens of guilt and shame, ignoring the fact that the same systems that once supported imperial ambitions also evolved to champion human rights, democracy, and the rule of law.
No,
Nath!
Oh, Nath! No, we are simply two noble Britishmen out on a stroll. Yes. Good day, sir. Good day.
In many countries that were under colonial rule, you almost certainly do not have the same rights to express your thoughts, practice your religion, or even the equality of sexes many self-hating Westerners enjoy. But there's a striking irony here. The intense focus on historical guilt and self-criticism seems to be predominantly a European and Western phenomenon. When we look at other parts of the world with their own histories of conquest and colonization, such as the Arab empires, the Mongol conquests, and the Ottoman Empire, we don't see the same level of self-flagellation or cultural shame, despite these empires often engaging in practices that were equally, if not more brutal and expansionist. There isn't the same pervasive narrative of guilt that drives modern-day discourse in the West. For instance, the Arab conquest spread across vast regions, from North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, often accompanied by forced conversion, slavery, and the suppression of local cultures. Many countries lost thousands of years of culture and tradition to Islamic expansion. Similarly, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, was built through brutal military campaigns that resulted in the deaths of millions and the destruction of entire cities. Yet, these historical actions are often viewed with a sense of pride or just another part of history, rather than a source of ongoing collective guilt. When was the last time you heard modern-day Arabs and Mongols apologize for atrocities of their colonial past?
It's those goddamn Mongolian again! Stop! Stop right there, Mongolian! God damn it, stop!
I've certainly not seen it in modern, mainstream discourse. If anything, I hear some of these groups complaining about Western colonialism far more often. Recently, ironically, a lot of that complaining has occurred at Western universities, where these groups enjoy far more privileges than the Middle East. Here's the thing though, while self-loathing is uniquely Western, these countries are also usually the only ones to try and actively remedy errors from the past, particularly with their indigenous populations. In Australia, efforts like the national apology to the stolen generations in 2008 were pivotal moments in acknowledging the suffering caused by past government policies. Billions are spent every year on government programs and other initiatives to help the indigenous population. Similarly, in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to address the painful legacy of residential schools, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and cultures. You would think this represents a society's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and make amends where possible. But where is the limit? Before we head into the next section, I'd really appreciate it if you could help me get to my end-year goal of 20,000 subscribers. So, please hit that subscribe button and give the video a thumbs up. Moving on, at what point does the effort to right past wrongs cross the line into overcorrection, where the focus shifts from meaningful reconciliation to self-flagellation? This is where we need to address the role of critical theory and the impact of institutions that have been captured by what some might call woke grievance goblins, those who promote a narrative of perpetual victimhood, regardless of the progress or remedies already achieved. Critical theory posits that society is structured around power dynamics that inherently privilege certain groups while oppressing others. In the past decade or so, not only have these ideas become mainstream, but this framework has been weaponized in ways that go beyond constructive critique. In many institutions, be it academia, media, or even government, we're seeing a shift where the narrative is dominated by this perpetual victimhood status. It's no longer enough to acknowledge past wrongs and work towards a fairer society. Instead, there's a growing pressure to constantly apologize, to continually atone, and to never let go of the sins of the past. Here in Australia, for example, you'll be hard-pressed to find workplaces, events, websites, or even apps that do not constantly either command a welcome to country or include an acknowledgement of country. HR departments force people, regardless of who they are, to include one before every meeting. It's quite Orwellian.
The practice suggests that Australians whose families have lived here for generations, possibly since settlement, are not welcome. The welcome to country is nothing more than something wealthy city people love to do to make themselves feel good. All Australians have the right to call this country home, but the activist and bureaucratic classes want division as it perpetuates the victimhood mindset which they use to manipulate people.
But what is the prize of this endless cycle of guilt and apology? How much is enough? Is it $1 trillion in reparations, paid mostly by people who had nothing to do with the past? Do the Italians, Greeks, Lebanese, Chinese, and Indian immigrants, who make up a large number of modern Australian society, for example, owe reparations? How do we even begin to calculate something like that? At what point does this no longer become about justice or reconciliation, but about maintaining a perpetual state of grievance that benefits no one except those who thrive on division? Douglas Murray, in his book The Madness of Crowds, argues that this obsession with identity politics and grievance culture is not only exhausting but also deeply corrosive. He suggests that by constantly keeping the wounds of history open, we prevent them from healing. We create a culture where progress is never recognized and where any attempt to move forward is met with accusations of denial and complicity. Murray points out that this kind of thinking leads to a society where the end goals are ill-defined, where the pursuit of justice becomes a never-ending chase for ever more abstract wrongs to right. It's a scenario where the demands are endless and the satisfaction is never achieved, because the true aim is not resolution, but perpetuation of the grievance. The truth is, this approach is not only unsustainable, but it's also deeply counterproductive. We're at risk of losing sight of the very principles that have allowed Western societies to thrive, principles like individual rights, democracy, and the rule of law. But for a lot of these people, none of that really matters. What matters is looking like a virtuous, morally superior person on TikTok. Someone who believes they have unlocked the secrets of history and by virtue of their newfound wisdom feels entitled to lecture others. It's a curious blend of moral licensing and the Dunning-Kruger effect, where a shallow grasp of complex issues somehow grants them the imagined moral high ground and power over the less enlightened. In many cases, this isn't about genuine concern or desire for change, but rather about enhancing one's social standing within a particular group. In the context of critical theory and perpetual victimhood narratives, virtue signaling often takes the form of conspicuous displays of guilt, contrition, or solidarity with marginalized groups. This behavior is reinforced by in-group thinking, where members of a social group reinforce each other's beliefs and actions to maintain cohesion and social standing. Remember the Black Square, or the All Eyes on Rafah crowd, who curiously don't have much to say about Hindus in Bangladesh or Christians in Egypt. Philosophically, this can be linked to concepts like moral masochism, where individuals derive satisfaction from self-punishment or self-debasement. Sigmund Freud touched on this in his works, describing moral masochism as a condition where people seek out guilt and suffering as a way to fulfill an unconscious need for self-punishment. This ties into the current climate, where many feel compelled to constantly apologize for historical wrongs, not necessarily to right those wrongs, but to satisfy an internal or socially imposed need to appear virtuous. This phenomenon can also be understood through social identity theory, which posits that individuals derive a significant part of their identity from the social groups to which they belong. In today's climate, aligning oneself with the correct moral positions on issues like colonialism or being anti-Western is a way to maintain or elevate one's status within these groups. Those who fail to signal their virtue, or worse, who challenge the prevailing narrative, risk social ostracization or being labeled as morally deficient. French philosopher Michel Foucault also provides insights into this dynamic with his concept of power and knowledge. Foucault argued that what we consider knowledge is often a reflection of the power dynamics within society, and those who control the narrative can shape what is considered morally or socially acceptable. In this case, the dominant narrative of guilt and perpetual atonement serves to reinforce the power of those who champion these views while marginalizing dissenting perspectives. The irony, of course, is that this cycle of virtue signaling and moral masochism often does little to address the actual issues at hand. In fact, I'd argue it's leading to something more nefarious. As we become more engrossed in this cycle of guilt, apology, and virtue signaling, we inadvertently create a vacuum, a space where Western values are not only questioned, but actively undermined. This opens the door for the adoption of ideologies that stand in stark contrast to the very principles that have made Western societies prosperous, free, and just. Take, for instance, the rapid growth of Islam in the Western sphere through mass immigration. A lot of people, especially on the left, have become xenophiliacs towards the religion, outright refusing to believe the way it commands people treat homosexuals, women, apostates, and non-believers. You can already see significant divides in many countries due to the clash of ideas, where hostile ideas like Islam has found itself a great ally in the form of leftist orthodoxy The consequences of this are already visible. I did a deep dive into this in a different video, which you can check out on my channel as well. We see demands for Sharia law in parts of Europe, restrictions on free speech in the name of avoiding offense, and a growing tolerance for practices that are antithetical to Western ideals. We often praise multiculturalism, but in the past few months, I don't think the Jewish populations of these countries have felt too safe, have they? And often, perpetrators are cheered on not just by blue-haired dye enjoyers and gym haters, but far-left political parties. The problem is, it doesn't just stop there. The backlash to this can be equally dangerous. You already see this with the UK riots. As more people become frustrated with the erosion of Western values and the constant demand for self-criticism, we see the rise of extremist groups. These same ideas replace the openness, inclusivity, and tolerance of Western values with hatred, exclusion, and violence. What we're left with is a polarized society where two extreme ideologies, both of which are fundamentally at odds with Western values, clash. One side seeks to dismantle Western civilization from within, using guilt and perpetual atonement as its weapons, while the other seeks to protect it through exclusion, hatred, and violence. Now, at the heart of this division does appear to be the lack of unifying experiences or values that people can rally behind. In the past, Western societies were often united by shared beliefs, traditions, and national pride. However, as these common threads have frayed, so too has the social fabric that held these societies together. One of the most significant shifts in this regard has been the decline of Christianity, which for centuries served as a cornerstone of Western identity and a source of shared moral values. Christianity provided a common set of beliefs, rituals, and ethical guidelines that helped to unify diverse populations across Europe and the Americas. It also instilled a sense of purpose and community, offering a framework for understanding the world and one's place within it. As Christianity's influence has waned, many Western societies have struggled to find a replacement, a new set of values or experiences that can provide the same sense of unity and belonging. Without a unifying narrative, people are left searching for meaning in an increasingly fragmented world. This void is often filled by identity politics, extreme ideologies, or the pursuit of individual gratification, none of which offer the same cohesive force as a shared belief system. I want to contrast this with another country, one that actually is in Asia, Singapore, a country that, in just one generation, transformed itself from a struggling post-colonial state into one of the most successful and prosperous nations in the world. It's genuinely a modern-day miracle. So how did Singapore achieve this? By fostering a strong, cohesive national identity and implementing policies that united its diverse population around shared goals and values. When Singapore gained independence in 1965, it faced numerous challenges: a lack of natural resources, ethnic and religious divisions, and a fragile economy. But under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, the country adopted a pragmatic approach to nation building that prioritized social cohesion and economic development. One of the key strategies Singapore employed was the promotion of multiracialism. The government implemented policies that ensured equal treatment for all ethnic groups and actively worked to prevent the formation of ethnic enclaves, the opposite of many countries, especially in Europe where integration isn't too important, leading to the formation of numerous enclaves like in Sweden. In Singapore, for example, the Housing Development Board created public housing projects that required a mix of ethnicities, ensuring that different communities lived and interacted together. This helped to build a sense of shared identity and mutual respect among Singaporeans. Another crucial factor was the implementation of national service. All male citizens were required to serve in the military, creating a common experience that transcended ethnic and religious differences. This not only instilled a sense of duty and patriotism, but also fostered bonds between individuals from different backgrounds, helping to create a more unified society. Contrast this to the UK. More British Muslims have joined ISIS than the British Armed Forces, according to the New York Times. Does that sound like an integrated group who wants the best for the UK? Education also played a significant role in Singapore's success. The government invested heavily in education, with a focus on creating a meritocratic system where individuals were rewarded based on their abilities and contributions, rather than their background. This helped to level the playing field and gave all Singaporeans a stake in the country's future. It's certainly rather frustrating to see the opposite, even here in Australia. In the past decade or so, Australia Day, as an example, has gone from a day where people celebrated national pride to one where people are now increasingly pressured into feeling guilty about a colonial past that many didn't have anything to do with. The opposing side successfully made it universal to now be ashamed of the country. They hate Australia Day, they hate the Anzacs, they hate any alliances with Western allies like the US and the UK, and more recently, they want to abolish the state entirely. But again, replace it with what exactly? Because it doesn't get much better. I'd really suggest many of these people go and speak to first-generation immigrants, many of whom are deeply patriotic to their new nation, because they know what it's like on the other side. I am one of them. I continue to be thankful to be here every day because, on the other side, I've seen firsthand the absence of the very freedoms and opportunity that many now take for granted. I grew up in a place where speaking out against the government could land you in prison, where religious freedom is a distant dream, and where the rule of law is often more of a suggestion than a guarantee. This perspective is why I find the growing disdain for Western values and institutions so perplexing. Those who advocate for dismantling the very systems that have enabled them to enjoy unprecedented freedoms and opportunities often fail to grasp what they're really asking for. But beyond the frustration lies a real concern. What happens if these voices succeed? As history has shown us, societies that lose faith in themselves are often the first to fall. Western societies would do very well to remember this lesson. If you enjoyed watching this video, why not check out more on my channel? As always, please hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.